They never understood the nature of silence. They thought your calm meant absence, that your lowered gaze was a sign of submission. You offered softness, not because you lacked age, but because you knew restraint is a weapon most people fear to wield. You entered rooms like mist, unseen,
yet everywhere.
You smiled, nodded, gave more than was ever returned, and in that quiet offering, they saw nothing but a blank canvas to project their superiority onto. They mistook your kindness for an unfinished thing, a draft, a weakness waiting to be corrected.
You listened instead of interrupting.
You yielded instead of contesting. To them, you were the harmless one, the harmless thing, a shadow without voice. But what they missed, what they could never grasp, was that you were reading them. Every slight, every condescending chuckle, every transaction dressed as conversation.
It all went into the archive.
The one behind your eyes, the one no one ever saw. You weren't reacting, you were collecting. They imagined you as a character in their story, a footnote, a background blur, the audience for their monologue. And for a while, you let them believe it, because it was safer that way. It was strategic. No one attacks the one they deem irrelevant. You became a mirror, reflecting just enough of what they wanted to see. But inside, there was motion, deep tectonic shifts, a rewriting. You studied the way they moved, the way they operated, like parasites mistaking their host for prey. You never once corrected their illusion, and the illusion grew fat. They laughed louder, grew bolder, mocked what they couldn't understand. Your compassion, your softness, your refusal to sink to their level. They confused peace with passivity, patience with paralysis. You were a cathedral of withheld storms, and they prayed at your altar, thinking it was just a floor. But something in you began to stir, not rage. No, rage is noisy and impulsive. What rose inside you was older, colder, the awareness that the time for observance was fading, and that your silence had taught them nothing but the wrong lesson. They saw a lamb, but there were bones under the wool, ancient ones, marked with runes they never bothered to translate. So you stayed still, one last time. Let them finish their performance. Let them bow in triumph. Let them feed off your seeming stillness. But even as they celebrated their illusion of dominance, the clock began ticking quietly from somewhere they couldn't hear, a countdown carved into shadow. Because you weren't weak, you were waiting, and nothing terrifies the world more than the one who smiles while building the storm. They didn't just laugh at you, they studied how you bled. You remember the way their eyes shifted when you entered the room, not with fear, not with reverence, but with the easy confidence of those who believed you harmless, a convenient background character in their play. You offered truth, and they extracted spectacle. You gave softness, and they sharpened it into a blade, twisted it, then passed it around like a joke written in your own skin. The ritual wasn't spontaneous, it was rehearsed. They took turns cloaked in irony, smiles dipped in acid, a comment here, a pause too long there. They thought they were clever, coordinated, like wolves circling what they believed was prey, too dumb to notice the teeth. But you noticed, you always noticed, the way they looked around for validation after each jab, needing the group's laughter to justify their cruelty, needing a witness, because their power only existed when echoed. There was something hollow in them, some ancient insecurity dressed in arrogance, and they found comfort in peeling your layers, thinking they were dismantling something fragile. But what they never understood was this: you were documenting every look, every word, every betrayal, categorized like a secret dossier, not for revenge, not yet, but because some part of you knew one day they'd need to remember what they chose to forget. You sat in silence, and they mistook it for surrender. That was their first mistake. They thought power was loud, flashy, performed. They didn't see the quiet in you for what it truly was: control under pressure, storms held back by ancient dam walls. You let them believe the performance, let them drink from the illusion, because you understood something older than all of them. Those who mock are always building their own gallows, one careless word at a time. The worst part, some of them weren't strangers. Some wore the face of friends. They smiled beside you while chiseling cracks into your confidence. And when it all became too obvious, too dark, they called it just teasing, hid behind tone, behind plausible deniability. You were always too sensitive, they said, as if empathy was a defect, as if your depth was their burden to bear. But you never wanted their approval. You wanted truth, and truth never comes clean. So you played your part, quiet, receptive, observant. You let them build the story where you were the fool, the soft one, the one who wouldn't dare bite back. All the while, you were crafting your counter-narrative in silence, in stillness. They didn't know the ritual of mockery was also your crucible. Every slight a hammer, every laugh a forge. They thought they were breaking, but they were tempering steel. There wasn't a sound when it happened. No explosion, no declaration, no visible break in the air. Just a shift, subtle, internal, irrevocable. The moment when your tolerance, once boundless and serene, thinned into something sharp and metallic. You didn't even flinch. You simply knew that the days of enduring had ended, that the part of you they mistook for gentleness had been a sleeping weapon, and now it stirred. They'll never understand the precision of that moment, the sacred silence that followed, because to them, change looks like noise, but your change was ancient, the way tectonic plates shift beneath cities before swallowing them whole. What cracked wasn't your spirit, it was the illusion, the mask of restraint you'd worn so flawlessly that even you forgot what lived underneath. You looked at the same faces, heard the same voices, but the meanings changed. Their laughter no longer sounded like dominance. It sounded like the ticking of a clock counting down to their collapse. You didn't lash out. You calculated. You didn't rage. You remembered the way they smirked while you lowered your gaze, the way they dismissed your input with hollow smiles. Each insult wasn't discarded. It was stored, encoded, converted into coordinates on a map they never knew you were drawing. They thought you were harmless because you never barked. They forgot that wolves don't announce themselves. The shift infected how you walked, how you observed, how you responded with fewer words, colder eyes, and it unnerved. They couldn't name what was different, but they felt it. An energy, a detachment, like a predator had entered the room wrapped in the skin of a ghost. You weren't seeking revenge. Not yet. You were becoming something else. You studied pressure points, social patterns, behavioral weaknesses. You learned how to disappear in plain sight, not to flee, but to gather silence like ammunition. Because patience doesn't die when it snaps. It evolves into discipline, into focus, into something far more dangerous than wrath. You began moving in shadows, creating gaps in their defenses they wouldn't notice for months, setting traps they'd blame on coincidence. You didn't attack them. You allowed them to, with just the absence of your presence.
Empires don't fall in flame. They rot quietly from within. And you became the rot they birthed through their arrogance. You were the slow unraveling of everything they thought was permanent, the consequence they never calculated, the test they failed before they even knew it had begun. And so, without lifting a hand, you watched as their certainty dissolved, because the moment your patience broke, it wasn't chaos that followed, it was precision. And in the ruins of what they once called control, you stood unbothered. You weren't the same. You weren't even human anymore. You were the reckoning dressed in everything they overlooked. You didn't disappear. You withdrew surgically, deliberately, like a blade sliding back into its sheath, not out of fear, but precision. The warmth they once mistook for weakness turned cold overnight. You stopped replying. You stopped showing up. And when you did, your eyes spoke less. Your laughter never returned. Your presence, once a balm, became a mirror. You offered them nothing to feed on. No reaction, no emotion, not even disdain. Just silence, tactical, heavy, echoing louder than any scream. They noticed, first with confusion, then with panic. The room felt different without you, not because they missed you, but because they began to sense what your absence revealed. The scaffolding of their illusions, once held firm by your patience, now trembled under its own weight. You had been their stability, their conscience, their quietly held advantage, and now, without your energy to leech, the chaos they had sown came back to bloom. You weren't punishing them, you were allowing the rot they cultivated to spread, uninterrupted. They talked among themselves, whispering your name like a question no one could answer. Where did you go? Why did you change? But they never asked the right question. What did we do? That kind of self-awareness was never in their vocabulary. Meanwhile, you watched from the shadows, recording, calculating, dissecting patterns like a master tactician in a war only one side knew was happening. Every move they made was a note in your growing ledger, not out of spite, but strategy, because the version of you they mocked was never the whole. It was a test, a veil, and now that veil had fallen. The illusion of fragility had collapsed, revealing the architect underneath. One who spoke less because words are for those without reach. One who gave space not to retreat, but to create distance, breathing room for the coming strike. You weren't angry, you were focused, not reactive but surgical. You understood the ancient laws of war: never interrupt your enemies while they dismantle themselves. So you let the silence grow roots. You let it haunt them, and in that void they began to break. Not with noise but with small implosions, relationships souring, reputations fraying, opportunities slipping through fingers they no longer controlled. The game had shifted. You were no longer the chessboard. You were the hand moving the pieces. They couldn't reach you anymore because you had ascended beyond their comprehension. You didn't leave the battlefield. You built a higher ground, and from there you watched, still, silent, tactical, waiting, not because you needed revenge, but because you already had it. The silence was the weapon, and it had struck deeper than any blow ever could. They didn't see it coming, not because you were invisible, but because they were blinded by arrogance, dulled by their addiction to underestimating you. You wore kindness like a cloak, patience like perfume. They thought that was all you were. But beneath it there was calculation, years of it. You had measured them in silence, memorized the rhythm of their lies, learned the weight of every smile that hid a dagger. While they laughed, you listened. While they postured, you plotted. You were never quiet. You were storing voltage. You struck without warning, not out of rage, but out of precision. Rage is chaotic. You were surgical. You didn't need noise. You didn't need spectacle. You needed one well-placed word in the right ear. One truth, sharpened, slipped beneath the door of their delusion. You whispered it like a curse into the bloodstream of their reputations. Careers faltered, invitations vanished, connections dissolved like sugar in hot water. They didn't even know what hit them. You weren't interested in revenge. This was reclamation, correction, balance. They mocked your softness, so you showed them the sharp edge hidden behind it. You didn't move through crowds anymore. You moved through systems, subtle architecture they never noticed until it collapsed. You weren't interested in destroying them outright. That would be mercy. You wanted them to feel the slow erosion of certainty, the gnawing suspicion that someone somewhere was unmaking. You became the untraceable variable, the black thread in their tapestry, the static behind the music. The world they built on the bones of your generosity began to buckle, and still you said nothing. You let consequence speak, let reality correct the narrative. You didn't need to convince anyone anymore. You had evolved past needing to be understood. Now you existed in a realm above explanation, a walking paradox, calm but dangerous, silent but thunderous, kind but capable of cruelty, colder than winter. They looked over their shoulder. They retraced their steps. They asked questions they were too proud to ask before. Was it them? Could it have been? But you left no fingerprints, no trail.
only absence. And in that absence they met their reflection, the one they refused to see when you were kind. Now it stared back at them with hollow eyes, and they understood what you had become. Not a villain, not a hero, a consequence, a shadow pulled from the light. They tried to extinguish. You didn't punish them because you were hurt. You punished them because they needed to learn. Your pain wasn't a weapon, it was the blueprint, and now they live inside the house they helped you build with the doors locked and the future shrinking. You don't need to hurt them anymore. You already rewrote the rules, and they're still playing a game that no longer exists. They don't recognize you anymore, and that's by design. The same mouths that once dismissed you now struggle to form your... You don't correct, you don't remind them. You let your absence speak louder than their noise ever could. What they once labeled passive was always precision in disguise. What they mocked as weakness was a depth they could never reach. You stopped giving them the version of you they felt entitled to, and they noticed, too late. Their grip on your identity slips like smoke between desperate fingers. They search for the person they used to manipulate, but that person died quietly in a room no one entered. You didn't seek revenge. You became unrecognizable. You erased yourself from their map, then redrew the terrain under your own name. No explosion, no spectacle, just a steady withdrawal like a king, abandoning a burning kingdom, knowing he never truly needed the throne. While they circled the ashes, you climbed, alone, higher, away from the echoes of applause and insult alike. You stopped explaining yourself, stopped trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding. You started moving like myth, fluid, formless, untouchable. Now your silence isn't emptiness, it's altitude. Where once you gave warmth freely, now your presence feels like consequence. Where once your words filled the void, now your absence is the void. They ask where you went, but what they're really asking is where the control was. You gave them a world softened by your empathy. They set fire to it, now they want it back. But your kindness has evolved into calculation. You don't offer access anymore. You offer distance, selective, surgical, strategic. Their chaos unfolds without you. It's quiet at the top but not lonely. The air tastes different when you no longer have to dilute yourself. You spend your time mastering instead of mending, studying patterns, building system, sharpening mind and motion like twin blades. Your hunger no longer seeks validation, it seeks legacy. While they still play games in rooms beneath you, you've learned how to rewrite the rules. You are no longer a participant, you are the algorithm behind the outcome, and they feel it in the way opportunities vanish, in the way rooms grow colder when your name is mentioned, in the questions that never get answered. You became the ghost in their machines, the shadow behind their sleepless nights. But you don't haunt, you outgrew that. There is no hatred, only clarity, the kind forged when a soul walks through fire, survives, and then builds the furnace for others to face.
You were never made to be understood by small mind. You were made to rise, alone if necessary, detached not out of bitterness, but because you finally realized the truth. Your power was never in what you gave, but in what you chose to withhold. They don't speak your name anymore, not out of respect, but out of fear that invoking you might summon consequences they can't explain. You didn't just destroy their narrative, you rewrote the laws of their reality, quietly, permanently. They remember the smirk they wore when they took what was yours, how they laughed while tightening the noose of their own downfall. You remember too, but not with rage, with clarity, because now you see it for what it was, a test, a necessary betrayal to ignite the ancient machinery within you. They thought they were the fire, you were just the spark, but sparks, when misread, burn down empires. What they didn't know is that while they were building altars to themselves, you were learning how to dismantle gods. Every mockery sharpened your edge, every dismissal distilled your focus. They believed they were breaking you, but in reality, they were tempering you, like steel passed through flame. Now their world cracks at the mention of your discipline, the same discipline they used to call obsession. Their peers ask what happened, their followers fade, their status rusts, all because you decided once to stop making peace with lesser minds. Your story, what they did, and what you became because of it, has morphed into cautionary scripture, passed between shadows, whispered when the next target is picked. Careful, that one might be another you. Another storm hidden beneath soft eyes and silences that say everything. They try to rewrite the past, to paint you as cold, overreactive, distant, but the truth stalks them. Every step they take echoes with what they did and what you became. Not vengeful, not vindictive, just precise. No threats, no warnings, just results. The kind of results that can't be undone. This wasn't revenge, it was memory with intention, a living archive of consequences. The pain they gave you returned, not doubled, but refined, channeled. They wanted to forget, but forgetting is a luxury reserved for the innocent. You never sought to be their lesson, but life required it, and now you are. Somewhere tonight, someone like you is being underestimated, mocked for their light, laughed at for their patience, but they're watching, waiting, building, and when their moment comes, it won't be loud. It'll be surgical, historic, just like yours. The cycle continues, because this world teaches through suffering, but some learn fast and turn suffering into signal, into legacy, into a blade carried in silence. They took your kindness for weakness. Now their legacy is a warning, their downfall, a monument. And you are the unspoken chapter in every predator's story, the lesson burned into history, written not in ink, but in silence, fire and irreversible transformation. They thought you were harmless, a soft voice in a loud world, the one who forgave too quickly, who gave too much, who smiled even when your heart was bruised and bleeding. You extended grace like a ritual, not because they deserved it, but because you believed in something deeper, something sacred. You carried patience like a torch through a forest of wolves, and they took it for submission. But kindness is not weakness, it's camouflage. They mistook your open hands for empty ones. They never saw what you were holding back. The storm, the strategy, the calculations whispered behind calm eyes. You were learning in silence, storing energy, watching their patterns like constellation, mapping betrayal like a battlefield. Every insult was ink in your ledger, every slight, a stitch in the armor they didn't know you were crafting. They fed you fire, thinking it would burn you. Instead, it forged you. You stopped speaking their language. You built your own, one coded in detachment, in decisive absence. Your boundaries became walls they could not scale, and in time, the same mouths that mocked your gentleness began to tremble in the echo of your silence. They could feel the shift, the cold precision in your distance. They realized too late that they had created something they couldn't control. You became untouchable, not because you retaliated, but because you transcended the game. And still you did not destroy them. You could have. You held the blueprint to their unraveling, but you chose evolution over revenge, because nothing terrifies the shallow more than being forgotten by the depths. Nothing haunts the cruel more than realizing the one they wounded no longer sees them at all. You didn't break them, you made them irrelevant. This was never about vengeance, it was about alignment. You were the weapon they never saw coming, because you never needed to be loud. You never needed to threaten. The most dangerous being in the room is the one who no longer needs to win. You had already won the moment you stopped needing their approval, their recognition, their guilt. Now they live with a different kind of fear, not of what you'll do, but of who else like you exists, silent, watching, learning. The next quiet soul they underestimate, the next calm presence they misread, the next force forged in restraint. Because your kindness was never a flaw, it was a test, and they failed it.
You were the myth they wrote off as a memory, but you returned as a warning.